The heavy bass of the obsidian vibrated through the floorboards of the dimly lit VIP lounge as the club manager gestured to the line of trembling women. "These ladies were specifically chosen for you, Mr. Thorne." Dominic didn't even look up from his glass of bourbon, his aura radiating absolute, chilling authority. "I'm not interested in this kind of service." The manager's face hardened. He violently grabbed Evelyn by the arm, dragging her forward. "Since Mr. Thorne doesn't want you, then you'll have to strip naked and entertain the drunks and homeless outside." Panic flared in Evelyn's eyes, her fierce pride breaking for a fraction of a second. "No." Suddenly, the cold, authoritative voice of the mafia boss cut through the room. "I changed my mind." Dominic stepped into the dim light, his predatory gaze locking onto Evelyn, analyzing her every breath. "So, you make a habit of this kind of work?" Evelyn lifted her chin, struggling to maintain her dignity under his suffocating presence. "It's not what you think." Dominic scoffed, a dark, mocking smirk playing on his lips. "Really? I thought this must be your normal gig." "What? You thought you could satisfy me with the vanilla stuff?" The sheer danger radiating from him was too much. Evelyn took a step back, her voice trembling. "I changed my mind. Can you please let me go?" Dominic stepped into her space, his towering frame trapping her. "Let you go? You came to the underworld by yourself. Now you want to leave." "I won't do it again," she whispered, her resolve crumbling. "Please just let me go." One of Dominic's heavily armed guards glanced at his boss. "What, you having second thoughts?" "You sure, boss?" Dominic backed away slightly, his expression returning to an impenetrable mask of ice. "Yeah, just giving her a warning. So she doesn't try this risky shit again." He turned his back on her, signaling for her to be thrown out. In that excruciating silence, the sterile, unapologetic voice of the hospital's billing department echoed violently in Evelyn's mind. "Asterisk, if you don't make the payment soon, we'll have to stop treatment. Your mother's condition is not good, asterisk." Her breath hitched. She couldn't walk out. She couldn't let her mother die just to save her own pride. "Let's go," Evelyn blurted out, her voice desperate. "You can do whatever you want, sir." "Please." Dominic paused, glancing over his shoulder. "I've been begged before. What makes you so different?" Evelyn swallowed her pride, her voice shaking but resolute. "Can I get paid first? I need $20,000. Dominic's eyes darkened with a mix of intrigue and cruelty. "Now show me what you're worth." He watched her clumsy, terrified attempts to approach him before sighing impatiently. "So quick. Do I have to teach you how to do this?" Tears of humiliation pricked Evelyn's eyes. "It's my first time." A sudden, intense stillness settled over Dominic. He closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, his large hands gripping her waist with terrifying possessiveness. "Now let me show you who's in control." "Good girl." Hours later, staring at the massive stacks of $100 bills tossed carelessly onto the table, Evelyn clutched her coat tightly around her shoulders. "Sir, this is way more than I asked for." Dominic adjusted his cuffs, not even bothering to look at her, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Once we're out of here, we're done. We never met." "Understood." Evelyn swallowed the bitter lump forming in her throat and nodded. She did not speak another word. With trembling fingers, she reached out and gathered exactly $20,000 from the scattered piles of cash, leaving the rest untouched on the cold glass table. She shoved the thick stacks into her worn leather bag, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every movement felt robotic, her body numb to the opulent surroundings of the penthouse suite. Dominic did not look back. His imposing figure remained by the floor-to-ceiling window, a dark silhouette against the glittering skyline of Chicago, completely detached from the wreckage he had just left behind. Evelyn turned and fled. She practically ran down the long, silent hallway, her heels sinking into the plush carpet. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like an eternity. When the glass doors finally slid open to the street, the biting night wind of the city hit her flushed face like a physical blow. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her frail shoulders, shivering not just from the freezing temperature, but from the phantom weight of his large hands still burning into her skin. The scent of expensive bourbon, dark tobacco, and cedarwood clung to her hair, a humiliating reminder of the transaction that had just stripped away the last fragments of her dignity. She walked briskly down the empty sidewalk, her arms wrapped protectively around her bag. Inside was the exact sum she needed to keep the hospital machines pumping air into her mother-failing lungs. $20,000. That was the price of her soul. Tears blurred her vision, mixing with the harsh winter rain that began to fall, but she fiercely wiped them away with the back of her hand. She had no right to cry. She had made a choice, and she would carry the weight of this shameful secret to her grave. Every shadow in the alleyways seemed to mock her, whispering about the underworld she had just willingly stepped into. The glittering lights of the Thorne Syndicate territory felt suffocating. Evelyn quickened her pace toward the nearest subway station, desperate to wash away the traces of the mafia boss. She promised herself, with every agonizing step, that this was the end of it. She had the money. Her mother would live. She would pay off the hospital, find a normal job, and erase Dominic Thorne from her memory forever. She would never, under any circumstances, set foot in the territory of the devil ever again. Evelyn pushed open the splintered door of her cramped apartment, her entire body trembling from the freezing rain and the traumatic weight of the night. The space was dark and suffocating, a stark contrast to the opulent penthouse she had just fled. She needed to see her mother at the hospital immediately, but she could not walk into the intensive care unit smelling of cheap club perfume, stale tobacco, and the lingering scent of Dominic Thorne. Placing the worn leather bag containing the $20,000 onto the scratched kitchen counter, she locked the deadbolt. It was her lifeline, the exact price of her mother's survival. Evelyn stepped into the tiny bathroom, turning the shower handle to let the freezing water wash over her. She scrubbed her skin until it turned red, desperately trying to erase the phantom sensations of the mafia boss and the humiliating transaction that had shattered her pride. Stepping out of the bathroom 10 minutes later with a towel wrapped tightly around her shivering frame, an unnatural draft hit her bare shoulders. The front door stood wide open. A jolt of pure terror struck Evelyn's heart. She lunged for the kitchen counter. The leather bag lay on its side, the zipper violently ripped open. It was completely empty. The thick stacks of $100 bills she had sacrificed her soul to obtain were gone. A frantic shuffling sound echoed from the apartment stairwell. Evelyn sprinted to the doorway, her wet feet slipping on the worn floorboards. Leaning over the rusted railing, she caught a fleeting glimpse of a messy blonde ponytail and a frantic, twitching frame disappearing down the final flight of stairs. Chloe, her younger sister, the reckless addict whose debts had forced Evelyn into the underworld in the first place. Evelyn screamed her sister's name, the sound tearing through her raw throat, but the heavy metal door at the bottom of the stairs slammed shut, cutting off her plea. Chloe had been hiding in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She had stolen the blood money to pay off her own street dealers and fund her next high, leaving their mother to die. Evelyn collapsed onto the dirty floor of the hallway, pulling her knees to her chest as a choked, agonizing sob ripped past her lips. The betrayal was a physical knife twisting in her gut. She had sold herself to a monster, and her own flesh and blood had robbed her of the only thing she gained from it. 2 hours later, Evelyn stood completely numb in the sterile, glaring white hallway of the hospital intensive care unit. The rhythmic, mechanical hissing of the ventilator from her mother room was the only sound keeping her tethered to reality. Dr. Evans stood in front of her, his clipboard held tightly to his chest, his eyes filled with a clinical pity that made Evelyn want to scream. He explained in a soft, apologetic tone that the hospital administration had reached their absolute limit. They could no longer extend the grace period for the mounting bills. If the outstanding balance of $20,000 was not paid in full by the following morning, they would be forced to legally disconnect Martha Hayes from the life support machines. Evelyn stared blindly at the doctor, the words echoing in her mind like a death sentence. The crushing weight of absolute despair threatened to swallow her whole. She looked through the glass window at her mother frail, pale body lying motionless amidst a sea of tubes and wires. Every breath her mother took was numbered. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her hands clenching into tight fists at her sides. The tears stopped falling. The suffocating grief in her chest crystallized into something entirely different. It hardened into a fierce, blinding rage that burned through her veins like liquid fire. She had lost her dignity, but she refused to lose her mother. Chloe had crossed the final line. Evelyn wiped her face, her eyes turning cold and resolute. She did not care how dangerous the city streets were at night. She did not care what vile corners of the criminal underworld she had to tear apart. She was going to hunt her sister down, drag her out of whatever drug den she was hiding in, and take back every single dollar of that money. The neon lights of the south side flickered like dying stars, casting long, distorted shadows over the cracked pavement. Evelyn marched through the decaying alleyways, her fear entirely consumed by a raw, blinding fury. She navigated the treacherous streets of the city underbelly, checking every shadowed corner and abandoned warehouse where she knew Chloe usually scored her illicit substances. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of rotting garbage and stale alcohol. After an agonizing hour of relentless searching, she arrived at a dilapidated tenement building notorious for housing the most dangerous street dealers in Chicago. She pushed past the rotting front door, ignoring the groans of addicts slumped against the graffiti-covered walls. She screamed her sister's name, her voice echoing sharply in the damp, foul-smelling corridor. A sickly-looking man with hollow eyes sneered at her from the darkness, but she shoved him aside, kicking open the door to a room where Chloe often hid. It was completely empty, save for dirty mattresses and discarded paraphernalia. Chloe was gone, and so was the money that was supposed to keep their mother alive. Frustration choked Evelyn as she stumbled back out into the suffocating alleyway. The freezing rain had stopped, but the biting wind cut through her thin coat, chilling her to the bone. Before she could take another step toward the main street to continue her desperate hunt, heavy footsteps echoed behind her. 5 men stepped out from the shadows, their expressions predatory and hungry. They were local enforcers, the kind of street trash that fed on vulnerability and despair. One of them, a bulky man with a jagged scar stretching across his neck, deliberately blocked her path. He looked her up and down, a vile smirk twisting his face. "Looking for your junkie sister, pretty lady?" the scarred man taunted, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and decay. "She already paid her debts and moved on to her next high. But you look like you could settle the interest for us tonight." Evelyn backed away, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. But her rage, fueled by the thought of her mother dying in that sterile hospital room, refused to let her cower. She was not the same terrified girl from the penthouse. She had nothing left to lose. "Get out of my way," she spat, her voice shockingly steady and laced with venom. The men laughed, a cruel, grating sound, as they closed the circle around her. A dirty hand reached out to grab the lapel of her coat. Evelyn did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She swung her heavy leather bag with all the strength she possessed, striking the man directly in the face. The heavy metal buckle caught his cheekbone, sending him stumbling backward with a violent curse. "You stupid bitch," another thug roared, lunging forward to grab her hair. Evelyn fought back like a cornered animal. She kicked, scratched, and bit, her fierce pride turning her terror into pure adrenaline. She managed to land a solid blow to another attacker's jaw, but the sheer difference in physical strength was overwhelmingly obvious. A heavy fist struck her shoulder with brutal force, sending her crashing onto the wet, unforgiving asphalt. The harsh impact knocked the breath from her lungs. As the 5 men loomed over her, pulling out switchblades and ready to exact their brutal revenge, a blinding pair of high-beam headlights swept across the narrow alleyway. The deep, guttural roar of high-performance engines shattered the tension. 3 sleek, bulletproof black SUVs aggressively blocked the entrance to the alley, their tires screeching against the wet pavement. The street thugs froze instantly. Absolute terror replaced their predatory grins the moment they recognized the silver insignia of the Thorne Syndicate gleaming on the vehicle grills. In the back seat of the lead vehicle, Dominic Thorne sat enveloped in the shadows. He had been returning from a tedious territory inspection, thoroughly irritated, until his piercing gaze caught the violent commotion in the alley. His dark eyes narrowed sharply when he recognized the frail but fiery woman from the VIP lounge. She was covered in street dirt, her clothes torn, her face bruised. Yet, she was glaring up at her armed attackers with a venomous defiance that commanded a strange, undeniable sense of respect. She was not a weeping, helpless victim waiting to be slaughtered. She was a fighter. Dominic tapped the thick partition glass once. His trusted enforcers poured out of the SUVs before the heavy vehicles even came to a complete stop. They moved with lethal, terrifying military precision. In a matter of agonizing seconds, the 5 street thugs were violently disarmed, beaten to a bloody pulp without a single word spoken, and dragged into the deep shadows, their muffled screams dying out in the cold night air. Evelyn remained on the cold ground, panting heavily, her wide eyes fixed on the tinted window of the main SUV as it slowly glided down. Dominic Thorne stared down at her from his untouchable throne. His handsome, ruthless face was illuminated by the pale, flickering streetlights, his aura radiating an absolute, chilling authority. He did not step out of the car. He did not offer his hand to help her up. He simply analyzed her battered, unyielding posture with a dark, calculating intensity that made her skin burn. Still fighting, his cold, deep voice cut through the eerie silence of the alley, lacking any trace of warmth or empathy. Evelyn gritted her teeth, forcing her aching body to push up from the wet pavement. She rested on her knees, her back straight, refusing to look weak in front of the monster who had purchased her dignity just hours ago. She met his predatory gaze with a burning intensity of her own. Dominic reached into the inner pocket of his perfectly tailored suit jacket. With a fluid, careless motion, he flicked a crisp, black card out of the open window. It fluttered in the freezing wind like a dark raven feather and landed precisely on the pavement at her feet. The tinted window immediately began to roll back up, sealing him away in his fortress of wealth and violence. "Clean yourself up," his voice echoed one final time before the thick glass shut completely, cutting off the connection between their 2 worlds. The 3 massive SUVs roared back to life, reversing out of the alley and disappearing into the treacherous Chicago night, leaving Evelyn entirely alone in the sudden quiet. She took a shuddering breath and looked down at the dark, damp pavement. Printed in elegant, imposing gold lettering on the thick black card were 2 words that promised both salvation and damnation: Thorne Holdings. The blinding morning sun offered no warmth as Evelyn stared at the thick black card resting on her cracked kitchen counter. The gold lettering of Thorne Holdings seemed to mock her desperate reality. The hospital administration had granted her a meager extension of 48 hours after she begged them on her hands and knees, but the invisible clock was ticking relentlessly. She had exhausted every loan option and every favor. In her darkest hour of absolute panic, she remembered an old college friend, Liam Mercer. Liam had recently secured a prestigious position in the marketing department of Thorne Holdings. Swallowing the last bitter remnants of her shattered pride, she picked up her phone and made the call. Liam was ecstatic to hear her voice and, upon hearing she was desperately seeking employment, immediately arranged an emergency interview for a suddenly vacant executive assistant position. He remained completely unaware of the dangerous, invisible web closing around her throat. 2 hours later, the towering glass and steel monolith of Thorne Holdings pierced the Chicago skyline like a giant, imposing sword. Evelyn stood on the bustling sidewalk before the massive structure, smoothing out the wrinkles in her only decent pencil skirt and white button-down blouse. Her dark bruises from the brutal alley fight were cleverly hidden beneath heavy layers of cheap foundation, but her internal scars throbbed violently with every step she took into the grand marble lobby. Liam met her near the security gates, his warm, genuine smile offering a brief sanctuary in the freezing, hyper-professional environment. He squeezed her shoulder, wishing her luck, while warning her in a hushed, nervous tone that the chief executive officer was notoriously ruthless and had fired 3 highly qualified assistants in the past month alone. Evelyn simply nodded, her mind focused entirely on the life-saving salary and health insurance the corporate position promised. She could handle a demanding boss. She had survived far worse monsters in the dark. A silent, private elevator whisked her up to the top floor, her stomach plummeting with the rapid ascent. The executive suite was a terrifying display of minimalist wealth and absolute, unyielding power. Heavy mahogany doors swung open to reveal a cavernous office lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling, concrete expanse of the city. Sitting behind a massive black glass desk, his broad back turned toward the entrance, was the imposing silhouette of the chief executive officer. The head of human resources cleared her throat, nervously introducing Evelyn as the highly recommended candidate from the marketing division. The heavy leather chair slowly rotated. The breath instantly and violently left Evelyn's lungs. The world around her spun into a dizzying, sickening blur. Sitting on the throne of the corporate empire, wearing a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit that screamed immeasurable wealth, was the monster from the VIP lounge, Dominic Thorne. His dark, predatory eyes locked onto her pale face, dissecting her absolute terror with chilling precision. He did not flinch. He did not show a single ounce of surprise. Evelyn dug her fingernails painfully deep into her palms, praying her trembling legs would not collapse beneath her. She fully expected him to order her out, to expose her humiliating secret right there in the glaring daylight to the entire human resources department. Instead, a slow, dangerous smirk tugged at the corner of Dominic's lips. He dismissed the human resources director with a single, arrogant flick of his wrist. When the heavy wooden doors clicked shut, leaving them entirely alone, the suffocating silence stretched until Evelyn felt she might actually drown in it. The familiar, intoxicating scent of expensive cedarwood and dark tobacco drifted across the room, paralyzing her senses. Dominic leaned forward, resting his large, powerful hands on the pristine glass desk. He acted entirely oblivious to the traumatic night he had purchased her body and the violent alleyway where he had witnessed her bleed. He casually picked up her printed resume, his deep voice dripping with a cruel, mocking professionalism. "Evelyn Hayes," he murmured, tasting her name on his tongue as if it were a rare, dark wine. "A flawless academic record. Top of your class. Yet, you're applying for a clerical position. Are you capable of handling extreme pressure, Miss Hayes?" Evelyn forced her voice to remain steady, refusing to break eye contact or show him the terrifying vulnerability clawing at her throat. "I am capable of enduring anything to get the job done, sir. I need this position." "Anything?" Dominic repeated softly, his eyes darkening with a vicious, unspoken promise of torment. He threw the resume aside, clearly uninterested in her typing speed or organizational skills. He leaned back in his towering chair, his imposing frame dominating the entire room. He issued his verdict without a single moment of hesitation, completely bypassing all standard corporate protocols. He hired her immediately. He stated her starting salary, a staggering figure that made her head spin, accompanied by an immediate signing bonus of exactly $20,000. The exact price of her mother life. The exact amount her sister had stolen. Evelyn stopped breathing. She stared at the cold, calculating billionaire, realizing the horrifying truth. This was not a coincidence. This was not a lucky job opportunity. The Ellie, the black card, the sudden vacancy in his office. He had orchestrated every single piece of this elaborate chess game to drag her back into his grasp. The trap slammed violently shut. Evelyn was no longer just a desperate girl fighting for survival in the slums. She was now the personal property of the devil himself, willingly stepping into his impenetrable golden cage. The $20,000 signing bonus was wired directly to the hospital administration the very next morning. The suffocating weight of the medical debt was finally lifted from Evelyn's shoulders, but the cost of her mother life was her own freedom. She had officially walked into the invisible glass cage of Thorne Holdings. The executive floor was a glamorous, terrifying snake pit. The senior administrative staff consisted of wealthy, impeccably dressed women who viewed the young, handsome chief executive officer as their ultimate prize. When Evelyn arrived in her cheap blouses and scuffed heels, the other secretaries immediately marked her as prey. They assumed she was just another desperate girl Dominic would chew up and discard within a week. They decided to accelerate the process, determined to break her spirit before she could even settle in. By her third day, a towering mountain of complicated logistical reports, impenetrable financial spreadsheets, and overlapping international flight schedules covered her small desk. The head secretary dropped a massive stack of disorganized legal contracts in front of her, demanding they be summarized and digitized by the following morning. They isolated Evelyn completely. They withheld crucial corporate passwords, ignored her requests for basic office supplies, and loudly whispered cruel insults about her cheap clothes whenever she walked past the break room. They wanted to humiliate her. They wanted her to run out of the towering glass building in tears. Inside his cavernous office, Dominic watched the silent torment unfold through the reinforced glass walls. He sat back in his black leather chair, a glass of expensive bourbon resting in his hand, his dark eyes calculating every single move. He deliberately did nothing to stop the vicious bullying. In his violent mafia-rolled world, weakness was a death sentence. He wanted to see exactly how much pressure this fierce little street fighter could endure before she shattered into pieces. More than that, Dominic craved the moment she would finally surrender. He waited with predatory anticipation for her to march into his office, tears streaming down her pale cheeks, and beg for his protection. He wanted her to realize that she was entirely helpless in his world, forcing her to submit completely to his authority. He wanted to be her only sanctuary. But Evelyn did not cry. She did not utter a single word of complaint. She simply tied her dark hair into a messy knot, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. Fueled by the profound knowledge that her mother was breathing comfortably in a secure hospital room, Evelyn attacked the insurmountable workload with a terrifying, silent ferocity. She skipped her lunch breaks entirely. She ignored the vicious gossip echoing through the halls. While the other women left the office exactly at 5 o'clock to attend expensive dinners and cocktail parties, Evelyn remained anchored to her desk under the harsh fluorescent lights, her fingers flying across the keyboard with relentless precision. Midnight approached on a Friday. The entire executive floor was dead silent, swallowed by the cold shadows of the sleeping city. Inside the grand office, Dominic was reviewing a confidential syndicate file when the heavy mahogany door softly clicked open. Evelyn walked in. Her face was incredibly pale with exhaustion, and dark circles shadowed her beautiful eyes. She carried a thick, perfectly organized binder. She walked straight to his massive desk and placed the binder down with a quiet, solid thud. She had completed every single impossible task the other women had designed to destroy her. The financial summaries were flawless. The international schedules were perfectly synchronized. Every legal contract was meticulously digitized. Dominic stared at the thick binder, then slowly raised his gaze to meet hers. There was no plea for help in her eyes. There were no tears of frustration. There was only a burning, unyielding defiance that refused to be extinguished. She stood before the most dangerous man in Chicago, physically drained but spiritually unbroken. "Is there anything else you require tonight, sir?" she asked, her voice completely steady and chillingly professional. A heavy, electric tension flooded the quiet room. Dominic felt a sudden, violent shift deep within his chest. The cruel, mocking amusement he had felt all week completely evaporated, rapidly replaced by a dark, all-consuming obsession. He realized in that quiet moment that Evelyn Hayes was not a fragile bird he could simply trap and crush in his hands. Her fierce independence was intoxicating. She had survived the brutal reality of the gutter, and now she was surviving the venomous reality of his empire. Dominic stood up slowly, his towering frame casting a long, dominant shadow over her small figure. His predatory instincts were fully awakened, roaring to life for the magnificent, stubborn creature standing in front of him. He did not want to break her anymore. He wanted to possess every single piece of her unbreakable soul. The midday sun glared against the towering glass windows of the executive floor. Evelyn rubbed her aching temples, trying to focus on the glowing monitor. A soft knock on her cubicle partition made her jump. Liam stood there, holding a warm container of food from a local deli. His kind smile was a sudden burst of sunlight in the freezing corporate wasteland. He noticed her extremely pale complexion and insisted she stop working to eat. Evelyn felt a genuine wave of gratitude. For a brief moment, she forgot the terrifying billionaire sitting just a few feet away behind the reinforced glass walls. She laughed softly at a joke Liam made, accepting the food with a gentle, appreciative smile. Inside the cavernous office, Dominic sat frozen behind his massive mahogany desk. His dark, predatory eyes were locked onto the live feed from the security cameras displayed on his tablet. The sight of Evelyn smiling at another man sent a violent, uncontrollable surge of possessive rage through his veins. She had never smiled at him like that. She only offered him cold professionalism and terrified defiance. When the marketing boy dared to gently touch her shoulder, Dominic clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached. The expensive crystal glass in his hand cracked under the sudden, immense pressure of his grip. Dominic picked up his private phone and pressed a single button. The head of human resources answered immediately. The voice of the mafia boss was deadly calm, completely masking the inferno burning inside his chest. He ordered the immediate transfer of Liam Mercer to the newly established logistics branch in South Africa. The directive was absolute and required Liam to be on a plane by 6 o'clock that very evening. If he refused, his entire career in the corporate world would be permanently destroyed. Less than 10 minutes later, Evelyn watched in utter confusion and horror as 2 large security personnel abruptly escorted a bewildered Liam out of the marketing department and toward the elevators. Before she could even stand up to process the sudden cruelty, the intercom on her desk buzzed. The heavy, commanding voice of the chief executive officer echoed through the small speaker, ordering her into his office immediately. Evelyn grabbed her notepad and walked through the heavy wooden doors. The moment she crossed the threshold, a heavy electronic lock engaged with a sharp click, sealing them inside the soundproof room. Panic flared instantly in her chest. Dominic slowly stood up, shedding his tailored suit jacket. He stalked toward her like a lethal predator cornering its prey. The intoxicating scent of dark tobacco and cedarwood filled her lungs, suffocating her rational thoughts. He stopped mere inches from her, effectively trapping her against the heavy wooden door. "You seem highly distracted today, Miss Hayes," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating with a dark, territorial threat. Evelyn lifted her chin, struggling desperately to keep her breathing steady under his crushing presence. "I am perfectly focused on my work, sir." Dominic leaned closer, his dark eyes burning into hers with a terrifying intensity. "Then why is a low-level marketing assistant hovering around your desk during company hours?" Evelyn's heart hammered wildly against her ribs. "Liam is an old friend from college. He was just bringing me lunch because I have not had a moment to step away from the workload you approved." Dominic raised his hand and gripped her jaw. His touch was firm but shockingly gentle, forcing her to look directly into his possessive gaze. "You do not have friends in this building. You work for me. You belong to this office." Evelyn pushed his hand away, her fierce pride breaking right through her terror. "You bought my time to do your paperwork. You did not buy my personal life. I am not your property, and you have no right to exile a good man just because he handed me a meal." A dangerous, dark smirk touched his lips. He leaned his face agonizingly close to her ear, his hot breath sending violent shivers down her spine. "Everything in this empire belongs to me, Evelyn. And we are going to work overtime tonight until you fully understand exactly who is in control." The grueling overtime session had lasted well past midnight. Evelyn finally walked out of the towering glass monolith of Thorne Holdings, her body aching with an extreme, bone-deep exhaustion. The chilling threat Dominic had whispered in his office still echoed loudly in her mind, a constant, heavy reminder of the absolute control he possessed over every aspect of her life. Outside, the Chicago sky had completely broken open, unleashing a torrential downpour that instantly soaked her thin clothes. She wrapped her coat tightly around her shivering frame and hurried toward the nearest subway station, desperate for the meager comfort and safety of her tiny apartment. When she finally climbed the creaking, poorly lit stairs to her floor, a horrifying sight awaited her in the narrow corridor. 3 large black trash bags were dumped unceremoniously on the dirty floorboards, leaking rainwater and exposing her meager personal belongings. Her apartment door stood wide open, and the burly landlord stood in the doorway, aggressively changing the brass locks. Evelyn froze, her heart immediately dropping into her stomach. She rushed forward, her voice trembling as she asked what was happening. The landlord sneered, tossing her original security deposit in a crumpled paper envelope directly at her feet. He loudly claimed the entire building had been suddenly bought out by a major corporate development firm that very evening, and all month-to-month tenants were legally ordered to vacate the premises immediately. Evelyn pleaded with him, frantically explaining that it was the middle of the night and pouring freezing rain, but he simply scowled and slammed the heavy wooden door right in her face. Evelyn stood completely abandoned in the dark, freezing hallway. She slowly dragged her heavy trash bags down the stairs and out to the street, seeking shelter under a broken canvas awning. The cold wind bit viciously into her soaked skin, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably. She had absolutely no money for a hotel room, and her mother was fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. She was entirely alone in a dark, unforgiving city. Suddenly, the blinding high-beam headlights of a massive vehicle cut through the heavy, relentless rain. A sleek black SUV glided smoothly to a halt right in front of the broken awning. The heavy rear door opened, and a large black umbrella blossomed into the violent storm. Dominic Thorne stepped out onto the flooded pavement. He wore a dark tailored wool overcoat, his towering presence commanding and completely untouched by the chaotic weather raging around him. Evelyn stared at his handsome, ruthless face, a sickening realization violently washing over her. The sudden, unannounced buyout of her residential building. The immediate, illegal eviction. This was entirely his doing. He had meticulously orchestrated her absolute ruin just to force her into a corner with no escape. Dominic stopped directly in front of her, the large umbrella shielding them both from the freezing downpour. His dark, predatory eyes swept over her soaked hair and trembling blue lips. He did not offer a single apology or an explanation for his cruel manipulation. He simply gave a terrifyingly calm, absolute command. He told her to get into the car. Evelyn gripped her wet plastic bags, her fierce pride flaring one final time despite her physical weakness. She looked him right in the eye and told him she would much rather sleep on the wet concrete than ever owe him another favor. Dominic did not bother to argue with her defiance. He simply stepped closer, invading her personal space entirely, and effortlessly lifted her frail body into his strong arms. Evelyn gasped loudly, too physically drained and freezing to fight off his dominating grip. He tossed her belongings to his silent driver and placed her gently but firmly into the heated leather back seat of the massive SUV. The heavy doors locked instantly with a sharp click. She was trapped in his golden cage once again. The drive through the stormy city was silent and incredibly swift. The vehicle descended into the highly secure underground parking garage of the most exclusive residential tower in Chicago. Dominic personally escorted her into a private glass elevator that opened directly into his massive penthouse suite. It was the exact same opulent, terrifying place where she had sacrificed her dignity just weeks ago. The floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the stormy, glittering city far below them. Evelyn stood violently shivering in the grand foyer, freezing rain dripping from her clothes onto the pristine black marble floor. The pure adrenaline that had kept her functioning for the past week suddenly and completely vanished. The crushing emotional weight of her sister stealing the money, the intense corporate bullying she endured, and the freezing rain finally broke her absolute physical limits. Her vision severely blurred. The luxurious room tilted violently around her. Before she could even take another step forward, her knees buckled completely. Dominic caught her instantly before she could hit the hard floor. His strong arms wrapped tightly around her waist, pulling her against his warm, broad chest. He cursed harshly under his breath, feeling the intense, unnatural heat radiating from her pale skin. She was burning up with a severe, dangerous fever. The fierce little street fighter had finally collapsed in his arms. He carried her swiftly into his expansive master bedroom, laying her very gently onto the massive silk bed. He completely ignored the extremely expensive sheets getting soaked by her ruined clothes. Dominic immediately called his private syndicate doctor, demanding with lethal authority that the medical professional arrive within 10 minutes. Then, the ruthless mafia boss did something entirely uncharacteristic. He walked into the adjoining marble bathroom, soaked a clean, soft towel in warm water, and returned to the side of the bed. Evelyn tossed and turned in a feverish haze, her brow deeply furrowed in physical pain, whispering delirious, heartbreaking pleas for her sick mother. Dominic sat on the very edge of the mattress, his towering, intimidating frame hunched over her small, fragile body. With an awkward but incredibly gentle touch, he slowly wiped the damp hair away from her burning face, tracing the soft line of her cheek with his thumb. The cold-blooded monster who commanded the darkest, most violent corners of the city underworld found himself meticulously and carefully tending to a sick girl. He watched her chest rise and fall with shallow breaths, his dark, terrifying obsession rapidly solidifying into an unbreakable, violent vow. He had broken her world apart piece by piece, and now he was going to be the absolute only one allowed to put her back together. Evelyn returned to the towering glass monolith of Thorne Holdings 3 days later. Her severe fever had finally broken under the meticulous care of the private doctor Dominic provided. She was now a permanent resident of the heavily guarded penthouse suite. The transition felt incredibly surreal. By night, she slept in a lavish guest room down the hall from the most dangerous man in Chicago, and by day, she resumed her grueling duties as his executive assistant. The other secretaries glared at her with renewed, venomous envy, fully aware that she was arriving to work in the tinted vehicles belonging to the chief executive officer. The delicate illusion of her new reality shattered violently on a Tuesday afternoon. The private elevator doors pinged open, and Vivian Russo stepped onto the executive floor like a conquering queen. Vivian was the only daughter of the Russo syndicate, the most powerful mafia alliance Dominic possessed. She was stunningly beautiful, wrapped entirely in custom Italian couture, dripping in flawless diamonds, and radiating an overwhelming aura of generational wealth and lethal arrogance. Everyone in the criminal underworld knew Vivian considered herself the untouchable future wife of Dominic Thorne. Vivian marched directly past the reception desk, her sharp stiletto heels clicking menacingly on the polished marble. Her dark eyes immediately locked onto Evelyn. Rumors of the new street girl living in the Thorne penthouse had clearly reached the Russo estate. Vivian stopped right in front of Evelyn's small cubicle, her lips curling into a vicious, degrading sneer. "So this is the cheap little stray Dominic picked up from the gutter," Vivian announced loudly, ensuring every single secretary and security guard on the floor heard her cruel assessment. "You must have a few interesting tricks to keep his attention for an entire week. But do not flatter yourself, sweetheart. He always throws the trash away when it starts to smell." Evelyn stood up slowly, refusing to cower before the mafia princess. She kept her posture perfectly straight, her voice chillingly professional. "If you do not have a scheduled appointment with Mr. Thorne, I must ask you to wait in the lobby." The sheer audacity of a common secretary speaking back to her made Vivian's eyes flash with pure, unadulterated rage. Without a single second of hesitation, Vivian raised her hand and delivered a brutal, ringing slap across Evelyn's face. The sharp crack echoed through the sudden, deathly silence of the executive floor. Evelyn's head snapped to the side, the metallic taste of blood instantly filling her mouth. The heavy diamond ring on Vivian's finger had cut deeply into her pale cheek. "Know your place, you filthy little whore," Vivian hissed venomously. Before Evelyn could even react, the heavy mahogany doors of the master office swung open. Dominic stepped out into the chaotic bullpen. His imposing, terrifying presence immediately sucked the air out of the room. His dark, predatory gaze swept over the scene, landing heavily on the bright red mark and the thin trail of blood on Evelyn's cheek. The temperature in the room plummeted to freezing. Vivian immediately dropped her vicious demeanor. She smiled brightly, stepping forward to loop her manicured hand intimately around Dominic's arm. She purred his name, leaning against his chest as if she owned him completely, casually dismissing the violent assault she had just committed. Evelyn looked directly at Dominic, her chest heaving, her fierce pride waiting for the monster who had claimed her to unleash his terrifying wrath. She waited for him to protect her, just like he had in the dark alleyway. But Dominic did not move. He stared at Evelyn's bleeding cheek, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek, but he remained completely silent. The delicate, multi-million-dollar alliance with the Russo syndicate hung precariously in the balance. A massive shipment of illegal arms was docking at the Russo-controlled ports that very midnight. He could not start a full-blown mafia war over a slapped secretary in the middle of a corporate office. Dominic tore his dark eyes away from Evelyn. He looked down at Vivian and coldly told her to step inside his office to discuss their business. He turned his broad back on Evelyn and walked away, pulling the mafia princess into his sanctuary and letting the heavy wooden doors click shut behind them. Evelyn stood entirely alone in the center of the hostel room, surrounded by the mocking whispers of the other women. The physical sting on her cheek was absolutely nothing compared to the violent, crushing agony expanding in her chest. The silence from Dominic was a brutal, defining slap of its own. It shattered the confusing, vulnerable feelings she had started to harbor for him during her sickness. It did not matter that he paid her mother medical bills or carried her out of the freezing rain. To the undisputed king of the underworld, she was never going to be a queen. She was just a temporary plaything, a pawn who had to stand there and bleed silently while the real rulers of the empire conducted their business. The humiliation in the executive bullpen acted as a final, brutal awakening for Evelyn. As she wiped the blood from her cheek with a trembling hand, the last remnants of her naivety dissolved into a cold, hard resolve. She realized that as long as she remained Dominic's personal secretary, she would never be anything more than a shadow in his world, a target for every predator in his orbit. The next morning, she did not wait for his summons. She marched into his cavernous office before he could even pour his first drink and placed a formal, typed document on his black glass desk. Dominic looked at the paper, his dark eyes narrowing as he read her request for a permanent transfer to the marketing department. He leaned back in his chair, his aura radiating a suffocating, territorial heat. He asked her if she was still sulking about the Russo incident, his voice devoid of apology. He told her that he had handled the situation in his own way and that her position as his secretary was non-negotiable because he required her within his sight at all times. Evelyn did not flinch. She met his predatory gaze with an unyielding intensity that made the air in the room crackle. She told him that she would no longer be his pet or a punching bag for his business partners. She stated that if he truly valued her worth as more than a temporary distraction, he would let her prove it in the arena of business. She told him she wanted to stand beside him on her own terms, not as a subordinate he could ignore when the real monsters entered the room. Dominic stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. The fierce independence he had tried to crush was now the very thing that made him crave her more than his own empire. He finally sighed, a dark, dangerous smirk playing on his lips, and signed the transfer. He told her she had exactly 30 days to prove she wasn't wasting his time, or he would drag her back to his office by force. Evelyn moved to a small, cramped desk on the 10th floor, far away from the gilded cage of the penthouse. She worked with a silent, terrifying ferocity that put the rest of the marketing team to shame. She spent 18 hours a day analyzing market trends, cold calling potential investors, and sleeping on the office couch. She completely ignored the whispers that she was a fallen favorite and focused entirely on the largest, most elusive project in the company history, the redevelopment of the historic West End district. The project was considered a lost cause, a billion-dollar black hole that no one wanted to touch because of the intense political red tape. Evelyn ignored the warnings. She spent 3 weeks straight outside the offices of the City Planning Commission, charming officials and presenting a flawless, innovative strategy that promised to revitalize the community while generating massive profits for Thorne Holdings. On the final day of her 30-day deadline, Evelyn walked back into the executive suite. She did not look like the broken girl from the alley or the battered secretary from the bullpen. She wore a sharp, professional suit, and carried a signed, multi-million-dollar contract with the city of Chicago. She placed the leather folder on Dominic's desk with a quiet, triumphant thud. Dominic opened the folder, his eyes widening as he saw the signatures he had been trying to secure for years. He looked up at her, a strange, undeniable sense of pride flashing in his dark gaze. Evelyn told him that her mother's surgery was a success, and she had officially earned enough in commission to repay every single cent of the signing bonus he had used to trap her. She told him that for the first time since they met, she owed him absolutely nothing. She stood before the king of the underworld not as a victim, but as his most valuable asset, proving that her spirit was a force that even the Thorne Syndicate could not truly own. The news of Evelyn's historic victory in the West End project spread through the Thorne Holdings skyscraper like wildfire, turning her into a living legend within the corporate walls. However, as her professional star ascended, the shadows in the criminal underworld grew longer and more treacherous. Vivian Russo watched from the sidelines, her pride festering into a poisonous, uncontrollable madness. The sight of Dominic looking at Evelyn with a mixture of respect and raw desire was a humiliation Vivian could not endure. To the Russo family, a woman was either a queen or a peasant, and Vivian was determined to remind the world exactly which one Evelyn Hayes truly was. The trap was set with a surgical, cruel precision that targeted Evelyn's only remaining weakness. It was a rainy Thursday evening when Evelyn's phone vibrated with a frantic, distorted call from Chloe. Her sister's voice was thick with terror, muffled by what sounded like violent sobbing and the harsh background noise of heavy machinery. Chloe begged for help, claiming she had been caught stealing from a high-level Russo dealer and was being held at the abandoned South Pier shipping yards. Despite the bitter betrayal and the thousands of dollars Chloe had stolen, Evelyn could not silence the protective instinct she had carried for her sister since childhood. She left the office immediately, failing to notice the dark, unmarked sedan that began to tail her the moment she exited the parking garage. The South Pier was a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers and rotting timber, swallowed by a thick, freezing fog rolling off Lake Michigan. Evelyn stepped out of her car, her heart hammer against her ribs. The only light came from the flickering orange glow of a few distant security lamps. She called out Chloe's name, her voice trembling as it echoed through the hollow steel corridors of the yard. Suddenly, four heavy-set men stepped out from behind a stack of blue containers, their faces hidden by dark tactical masks. Before Evelyn could scream or turn back to her vehicle, a heavy cloth soaked in a sweet, chemical odor was pressed firmly over her mouth and nose. She fought with every ounce of her strength, her fingernails clawing at her attackers, but the world rapidly dissolved into a dizzying, lightless void. When Evelyn finally drifted back into a painful, hazy consciousness, she found herself tied to a rusted metal chair in the center of a cavernous, freezing warehouse. Her wrists were bound so tightly with plastic zip ties that her hands had gone numb, and the metallic scent of old blood and salt water hung heavy in the air. Sitting on a crate directly in front of her, looking like a beautiful, vengeful demon in a white trench coat, was Vivian Russo. Chloe was slumped in a corner of the room, her eyes wide with a mixture of drug-induced stupor and genuine horror. It became immediately clear that the younger sister had been used as the bait, promised a few grams of high-grade heroin in exchange for making the call. Vivian stood up, her sharp stiletto heels clicking with a lethal rhythm on the concrete floor. She reached out and grabbed Evelyn's chin, forcing her to look up into eyes that were devoid of any human empathy. "I told you that Dominic throws out the trash," Vivian whispered, her voice a chilling, melodic hiss that made the hair on Evelyn's neck stand up. "But it seems you are more like a stubborn stain that refuses to be washed away. My father is very displeased with how you have disrupted our business interests. You made the mistake of thinking your little corporate wins meant something in the real world. In this world, you are nothing but a message I am about to send to my future husband." Vivian signaled to one of her guards, a massive man with a jagged scar across his brow. He stepped forward and delivered a brutal backhanded blow to Evelyn's face, sending her and the chair crashing onto the hard concrete. The impact jarred her entire frame, and a fresh trail of blood began to seep from the corner of her mouth. Vivian watched with a sickening, delighted smile as her men began to arrange a series of heavy chains and weighted anchors near the open loading dock that overlooked the black, churning waters of the lake. The plan was simple and horrific. Vivian intended to film a video of Evelyn being beaten and then nem her into the freezing depths of the harbor, ensuring her body was never found. It would be a definitive declaration of Russo power, a warning to Dominic that his obsession with a common girl had cost him his most valuable alliance. Evelyn gasped for air, her ribs aching from a heavy kick, but even as she looked death in the face, she refused to beg. She spat a mouthful of blood onto the pristine hem of Vivian's white coat, her eyes burning with a final, magnificent defiance. "You can kill me, Vivian," Evelyn rasped, her voice thick but unbroken. "But you will never be the woman he respects. You are just a coward hiding behind a family name." Vivian's face contorted into a mask of pure, murderous rage. She grabbed a heavy steel rod from a nearby workbench, her knuckles turning white with the force of her grip. She raised the weapon high, ready to shatter the spirit of the woman she could never truly defeat. Outside, the sound of the storm was suddenly drowned out by the thunderous, rhythmic thumping of low-flying helicopters and the screeching of dozens of high-performance tires against the wet gravel of the pier. The king of the Chicago underworld had arrived, and he was bringing an inferno with him. The heavy steel doors of the warehouse did not just open, they were obliterated as the massive armored truck rammed through the entrance, sending shards of metal and concrete flying through the stagnant air. The rhythmic thumping of the Thorne Syndicate helicopters overhead grew deafening, their searchlights cutting through the fog and flooding the dark interior with a blinding, heavenly white light. Vivian Russo froze, her hand still clutching the steel rod, as dozens of red laser dots appeared on her chest and the foreheads of her guards. Dominic Thorne stepped through the settled dust, his charcoal suit replaced by a tactical black coat that billowed around his towering frame like a shroud of death. He was no longer the calculated billionaire CEO. He was the undisputed king of Chicago, a lethal predator who had finally been pushed past the edge of sanity. His handsome face was a mask of chilling, absolute coldness, and the heavy automatic weapon in his steady hand looked like a natural extension of his arm. One of Vivian's guards made a desperate, stupid move toward his holster. Dominic did not even blink as he fired 2 precise shots. The man collapsed onto the concrete before his hand could even touch his weapon. The rest of the Russo enforcers immediately dropped their guns, sinking to their knees as Thorne elite hitmen flooded the floor, moving with a silent, terrifying military precision that made the Russo family look like amateurs. Dominic ignored everyone in the room. His burning gaze was locked entirely on Evelyn, who was still tied to the chair on the cold floor, her face battered and her white blouse stained with crimson. The sight of her blood triggered a primal, violent roar deep within his soul. He walked toward Vivian, his footsteps heavy and echoing like a funeral march. "Dominic, wait," Vivian screamed, her voice high and cracking with a terror she had never known. "This is a misunderstanding. Think about the alliance. My father will burn the city if you touch me." Dominic stopped mere inches from her, his aura so suffocating that Vivian actually began to hyperventilate. He did not yell. He did not growl. He spoke in a voice so quiet and devoid of humanity that it was far more terrifying than a shout. He told her that there was no more Russo family. He informed her that while she was playing games at the pier, his men were already seizing every Russo port and firebombing their warehouses across the state. He looked her directly in the eyes and told her that he would have tolerated her greed and her arrogance, but the moment she touched Evelyn, she signed her own death warrant. With a single, effortless motion, Dominic backhanded Vivian with such immense force that she flew across the room, crashing into the same crates where she had mocked Evelyn. He did not spare her another glance. He turned and dropped to his knees beside Evelyn, his large, trembling hands reaching out to pull the gag from her mouth. "I am sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking with a raw emotion that shocked even his own men. "I am so sorry I let them take you." Evelyn looked at him, her vision blurred by the swelling of her eye, but her spirit was still burning. She told him that she knew he would come. Dominic pulled a tactical knife and sliced through her zip ties in a single second. The moment she was free, she did not collapse. She grabbed his lapels, pulling him close, her blood smearing onto his pristine black coat. He lifted her frail body into his massive arms, cradling her as if she were made of the finest glass. He looked over at Chloe, who was cowering in the corner, sobbing in a drug-induced panic. Dominic's eyes turned into chips of black ice. He ordered his men to take Chloe to the high-security rehabilitation facility and to make sure she never saw the light of day until she was clean and had repaid every cent she stole through labor. Then he looked at Vivian, who was crawling on the floor, begging for mercy. Dominic gave a simple, cold command to his second-in-command, Victor. He told him to deliver Vivian to her father in a body bag if the Russo family did not surrender every remaining asset by dawn. As Dominic carried Evelyn out of the warehouse and into the freezing Chicago rain, he shielded her body with his own, refusing to let a single drop of water touch her. He placed her into the back of his armored SUV, pulling her tightly against his chest. He did not care about the millions of dollars he had just burned or the war he had started. He held her as the sirens wailed in the distance, his heart beating against hers. He realized that the empire was nothing without the woman who had the courage to tell him no. He was the monster that rolled the city, but Evelyn Hayes was the only one who rolled him. The surgery was a landmark success that the doctors called a miracle, but Evelyn knew it was the result of the absolute, unwavering will of a man who refused to let her lose another person she loved. In the weeks following the destruction of the Russo syndicate, Dominic secured a team of 7 world-class specialists to oversee Martha Hayes' recovery. For the first time in years, Evelyn sat by her mother's hospital bed without the suffocating weight of debt or the fear of the machines being silenced. Martha held her daughter's hand, her eyes clear and full of life, as they watched the Chicago skyline from the window of a private suite. The debt was paid, and the shadows that had haunted their family were finally burnt to ash. Dominic Thorne did not return to his cold, distant ways. Instead, he waited until the day Evelyn's mother was officially cleared to return home. He took Evelyn to the very top of the Thorne Holdings building, where the wind was quiet and the city lights looked like a sea of diamonds. He did not issue a command or demand her service. He stood before her with a vulnerability that few had ever seen, holding a ring that shone with a brilliance that rivaled the stars. He told her that he had spent his life building an empire of fear, but she had built a kingdom of hope within him. He asked her to stand beside him as his wife and his equal, promising that she would never have to fight a battle alone again. With tears of joy streaming down her face, Evelyn said yes, sealing a bond that was forged in fire and softened by grace. 6 months later, the executive floor of Thorne Holdings had been transformed into a place of innovation and respect. Evelyn stood in her new office as the director of marketing and strategy, her sharp professional attire accentuating her radiant glow. She was 7 weeks pregnant, carrying the first child of a new, legitimate legacy. The West End project was thriving, bringing life back to the community she had once struggled to survive in. Dominic walked into her office, his imposing frame softening the moment he saw her. He did not ask for a business update. He simply walked over to the thermostat to ensure the room was comfortable for her and draped a soft cashmere shawl over her shoulders. He kissed her temple, his large hand resting gently on her stomach. As they looked out at the city, they were changing together. This story teaches us that true worth is not measured by the size of your bank account or the power you hold over others, but by the resilience of your spirit and your capacity to love in the face of darkness. It reminds us that no matter how deep the gutter may seem, your dignity is an internal flame that no one can extinguish without your permission. The human value of loyalty and the courage to demand respect are the true foundations of any empire. We want to know how this journey made you feel. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose between your pride and the people you love? How do you relate Evelyn's strength to the challenges in your own life? Please share your thoughts and stories in the comments below so we can listen to the feelings from deep within your hearts. Your perspective is incredibly valuable to us. If this story touched your soul, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with those who need a reminder of their own strength. Your support helps us continue to bring you captivating and emotional stories every single day. We wish everyone watching this video a healthy life, a heart full of joy, and a daily existence filled with peace and prosperity. Thank you for your time and your heart. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.